Dear class, welcome to International Relations Lectures. This week we're talking about neorealism and structure as well as constructivism. In this lecture, I'm going to focus on neorealism and structure. So let's take a look. So neorealism is a concept introduced by Kenneth Waltz, and he starts talking about some of the ideas in Man, the State, and War. Again, as you know from before, the main question he's asking is why wars happen. You can't understand the cause of war if you examine human nature. So that's the main argument that Waltz introduces in his book. He says human nature does not change from day to day, so it cannot explain why there is world war on one day and not the day before, right? So he's saying if you just focus on human nature, number one, we're both capable of being selfish, but also good. But at the same time, our nature does not change from day to day on a global scale, right? And through time. So what should we do then? So he starts to look at what he calls the second level or inside the political system of states. And he's saying, is it possible that particular types of political systems cause war? He also starts looking at the international system or at the global level. And let's explore what that might be. So first, classical realists in IR like Hobbes, Kant, Carr, Morgenthau would argue that war has to do with the histories of two states, right? So we look at the internal condition of states, the political system, would look at human nature, but also these kinds of histories, they matter. And notice that I put Kant in this group, even though Kant is usually considered to be a liberal, right? So his ideas about states and human nature are that in general, human nature is good, so are states. He says the same thing as Hobbes does, but Hobbes is considered a realist. And so in this case, I'm going to say on the question of why wars happen, we can say Kant is a realist. Now, Waltz would say that perhaps we should look at the histories of things, but we cannot confirm just looking at the political system. We have to look at the international level. For Waltz, the third level or the international level is the most important. And he says, don't just look at the globe, don't just look at, all these countries. You need to look at particular things. And by that, I mean the material distribution of power. So what kind of power? He says material power is important. And by that, we mean military assets and their positions. Look at economic assets and positions. Look at the political influence that states have, such as in institutions, but in other kinds of scenarios. So these kinds of power are relevant for Waltz. And he says, if you plot these, for example, where the US has its military assets, where the Russians have their assets, where the Chinese have. So if you look at these, you can say where war is going to start. So this is how we understand the structure. So it's about the distribution of power, material power. So let's look at, for Waltz, then, structure has to do with the distribution of material power, right? And let's go back to what I say is the backstory. How did Waltz become involved in this, sort of theorizing where we're talking about structure, we're talking about material distribution, and the realists actually get quite involved in this. They start to add how many tanks a country has. They start to plot, like, where are these tanks distributed? What kind of distribution do we have in any region as far as different countries? So why did they get so much into this thing? So something happened in the 20th century. We have major developments in the physical and natural sciences, and they start to receive a lot of funding from states, but also, private interest groups. And we see the development of many institutes and conferences that are heavily funded during this time to support physicists and biologists, but more so the physicists. And when this is happening, then political scientists start to note that they are missing out in this project, and then they start to basically tell their own associations that start thinking about creating models that are predictive. Okay, so you see in some people like Alexander Wendt, who's influential in development of constructivism, as you know, he mentions this in his book on the quantum mind and social science, that these associations start to talk about developing quantitative predictive models. Okay, and with this we see a lot of money coming into the hands of political scientists. All these universities are developing everywhere, all these research institutes. Let's develop quantitative predictive models. So Waltz falls into this kind of framework. He is trying to develop some kind of predictive model about where wars will happen based on some kind of distribution of material assets and other kinds of influences, right? Okay. Waltz will say that polarity matters. And you'll see that in chapter 4, he talks about unipolarity, bipolarity, multipolarity. Essentially, polarity is the way that power is distributed and indicates how many superpowers there are in the world at any time. So let me stop here as far as neorealism and structure. Now that you understand this, you're going to have no problem understanding what Alexander Wendt is talking about as far as constructivism. So see you in the next lecture.